Good morning. I would like to welcome you to a conversation about reproductive justice at First Congregational United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. I am Barbara Gerlach, a retired minister of First Church who was active in advocating for abortion rights and providing options, counseling, and referral to women prior to the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which guaranteed women the right to abortion and reproductive choice. As we know, the recent Texas law banning abortion after the detection of a fetal heartbeat and recent Supreme Court arguments on a Mississippi law in the case Dobbs versus Jackson Health versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, banning abortion after 13 weeks, now threaten the reproductive rights of women guaranteed for 49 years by Roe v. Wade. Our discussion today will have four dimensions, four facets. I will begin with a brief history of the struggle to legalize abortion and advocate for medically safe reproductive care. Essence Ellis, fellow with the UCC Council for Health and Human Service Ministries, Chisholm, and also with the UCC Washington Office for Justice and Witness Ministries, will ground the issue of abortion rights in the larger context of reproductive justice and how it intersects with the issues of racial, economic, LGBTQ justice. Then, Reverend Kaeley McEvoy, Associate Pastor at Westmoreland United Church of Christ in Bethesda, Maryland, and also a member of First Church, will reflect on making decisions about our bodies and our lives and share her experience of having an abortion and the ethical and theological understandings that grounded her decision, and now her advocacy for reproductive justice. And then we will have Sandy Sorenson, Director of the UCC Washington Office of Justice and Witness Ministries, who will provide an overview of the legislative landscape and what we as people of faith can do to protect a woman's right to choose and have access to safe reproductive health care, especially in the face of the possibility that the Supreme Court rules to end or seriously erode the rights guaranteed by Roe v. Wade. And then we will close with a time for questions and answers, reflections, and closing prayer, led by Reverend Amanda Hendler-Voss, Senior Minister of First Church. So I will begin with a brief history. Throughout human history, women have had abortions and have used abortions as a form of birth control and having some kind of control over their own bodies and the numbers of size of family, children they want. Up until the 1800s, it was an accepted process that was not surrounded by any laws at all. The understanding was that women had that choice up until the experience of quickening or feeling the first movement of a fetus. We have to also know that up until 1965, we had as women no right even to use birth control until the Supreme Court decision in 1965, Griswold versus the state of Connecticut, which restricted, it came against the Planned Parenthood, who was giving out birth control contraceptives to women And that went all the way to the Supreme Court. A friend of mine was one of the women who was spoke at that particular on behalf of that particular case. And that was a very important decision. It gave women in 1965, married couples the right to privacy and the freedom to control their own reproduction and childbearing. And we have to understand that was the first step that builds the infrastructure for not only Roe v. Wade, but also for marriage equality, equal protection under the law for women. I would like to just go back and tell you the moment my own position became clear on abortion. It was 1971. I was in my last year studying to be a minister at Union Theological Seminary in New York City and part of a women's consciousness raising group where we got together every week to share our experience as women. One night, the discussion turned to abortion. One of my classmates described her experience of getting an abortion when she was a student at Brown University and coming to New York City with her mother for what we would call an illegal back alley abortion. It was shrouded in secrecy, in fear, and in danger. She arrived only with an address and a password to enter a brownstone house. She was ushered in by a man, maybe a doctor, wearing a mask, who quickly did the procedure in a dark, cluttered room without speaking a word to her and sent on her way. My second classmate had an abortion just after the cliff-hanging vote made abortion legal in New York City, in the state of New York. And her experience was as different as night from day. She went to a state-of-the-art clinic, talked to a counselor who explained everything that was going to happen and accompanied her through the procedure. She felt safe, respected, well cared for, and it became a time of deep ethical reflection and personal growth for her. 6 months later, when my husband and I became co-pastors of a church in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I trained to be a counselor with Clergy Consultation Service, a group of ministers and rabbis who could use their right to confidentiality to provide options counseling and referrals to women with unplanned, medically dangerous pregnancies so that they could obtain an abortion if that was their choice. It was one of the most moving experiences I have ever had. It was actually the best training I ever had for counseling as well. I felt like I was on holy ground as I supported women in making difficult decisions. And I provided options so they could choose. They could talk about what was possible in terms of abortion or adoption or carrying the resources to carry a child to term. But many came to us because we were one of the few places where they could get a referral for an abortion. By then it was legal in New York. So I was sending people to New York City where they were going to that same state-of-the-art clinic that was developed through the support of Clergy Consultation Service. And one of the things about that clinic was 1 out of every 10 abortions was a low-cost abortion for $25, so that it was accessible to anyone who needed reproductive care. During that period, I did a lot of speaking and advocacy around the issues of abortion rights. Roe v. Wade was not decided, but it was very much in the air. And I was always surprised at how much, as I told the stories of the people who were choosing to get an abortion, how many people would have their hearts and minds changed and become supportive of a woman's right to choose. Now, I want to just say that I share this because if Roe is overturned or further eroded, we will be going back to a time like this, a time when equal protection under the law is not protected, when there will be no unified framework in all states that provide women access to choice, reproductive choice, and certainly for abortion. And we will be going back to needing this kind of underground railroad of referrals and helping people access abortion. We will be going back to the inequality of the rich who can always find access and those who can't. We will be going back to unsafe reproductive care. And we will also be having, if this right is eroded, we can expect that following it, there will be the erosion of other rights covered by the equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, including marriage equality. So with that brief history, I would now like to turn to Essence Ellis, who is a fellow with the UCC Council of Health and Human Services Ministries and with the UCC Washington office, who will ground the right to abortion in the larger context of reproductive justice.
Wow, thank you, Barbara. It's really great to be here with y'all. And I'm just gonna jump us right on in. So as some of you may know, there are many different languages and words that people use to refer to different aspects of reproductive justice. So many people use reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice fairly interchangeably, but they're not the same because they have different concepts with varying frameworks. And so I'm not really using a PowerPoint today, but our friends at the National Council of Jewish Women have this amazing graphic that lays each of them out with their framework and concepts. And I threw it in the chat, but we can also, you can also kind of type it into Google. If you type in reproductive health versus reproductive justice, it'll be the second link and it'll give you the PDF. It's an amazing resource. And I kind of always have it in the back of my mind as I walk through these types of concepts and understandings. And so I want to start us off with reproductive health. And so reproductive health in action calls on the delivery of reproductive services, accessibility to those services, and education on those services, all of which are really amazing. But the framework itself focuses on filling in where systems and institutions are failing for the individual, rather than directly addressing the systemic issues that are actively oppressing the individual, which makes a bit of a difference. And so if we jump over to reproductive rights, which some of you may be a bit more familiar with, as stated in its name, it has to do with the legality of reproductive services. And so it focuses more on the individual and legal aspects of having reproductive rights rather than, again, big picture. And so when I talk about this, I like to use the I statement of some of my own ancestors were considered 3/5 of a human being. And so historically, legality has not always meant justice in this country. So while reproductive rights are extremely helpful to have in place, it does not guarantee that those reproductive services are accessible, equitable, and non-coercive. And so there needs to be, at least for me in practice, a holistic approach. And for me, that's where reproductive justice kind of comes in. And so reproductive justice speaks to systemic power imbalance or imbalances, and of course, the intricacies of our own varying identities and cultures. And there are many in this country. And so my point of reference for explaining reproductive justice in recent years has been Sister Song. And so Sister Song is this amazing reproductive justice collective based in Atlanta, Georgia. And so they were founded by 16 organizations made up of Native, Black, Latina, and Asian American women. And it's important that their ongoing work is consistently highlighted because they were one of the first prominent organizations solely focused on reproductive justice. And the UCC Senate resolutions share many of their values and concerns. And so Sister Song defines reproductive justice as, I quote, the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And this definition in and of itself is fully sufficient, but most conversations around reproductive anything begin and end with abortion. But abortion is not the full conversation. It is a very important part of this conversation, but it's not the full picture. And so reproductive justice is a human rights issue based on the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it goes beyond just choice. Reproductive justice as a movement is about access. And so what we want people to get access to, we want people to have access to contraception, comprehensive sex education, which the UCC has and we share with the UUA. It's called Our Whole Lives. It's amazing. We want people to have access to STI prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence assistance, adequate wages to support our families, safe homes, and so much more. So it's a very wide horizon. And so with that in mind, this conversation involves all of us, everyone. But too often, most individuals don't join the reproductive justice conversation until they are directly oppressed or negatively impacted in a way that they feel in their daily lives. So, of course, reproductive justice as a movement is not perfect, and there is a lot of room to grow. But in terms of being holistic and imagining amazing ways of life, the movement in and of itself is revolutionary. And so we have to remember that the imagining of reproductive justice as a movement has a foundation in womanism. And so womanism and function identifies and criticizes the oppression that Black women in particular face. So white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal values. Some of you may be asking, why didn't Essence just say intersectionality? I didn't say intersectionality because it's really important for us to name all of the things that we are able to identify as oppressors. And so if we use the blanket of intersectionality, which is a great theory, it's a great legal theory, and it's really great to practice and keep in your mind. But in the naming of a thing is when we're able to truly unpack and tackle a thing. And that is a very big word to bell hooks. And so back to what I was saying, many womanists recognize that their liberative work is for and with everyone in mind. I like to think of Maya Angelou's, no one of us can be free until everybody is free. So when we talk about abortion in the context of reproductive justice, we must always keep in mind that it's a part of a larger conversation, because white people with uteruses and rich people with uteruses will always have access to safe abortions. As Barbara said earlier, rich people are gonna find a way to get there because they have access, be that through their ability to afford substantially better healthcare in this country, or having disposable time, money, and or transportation. Either way, this is about resource and access. And so abortion has and always will exist. It is a matter of accessing abortion in a way that is consistently safe and equitable on all fronts that we need to be working towards. And so that's all I have for us today, but really excited to be here and be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Essence, for expanding our framework to reproductive justice and stretching us in so many different ways to see the larger picture. We will now turn to the Reverend Kaeley McEvoy, who is Associate Minister at Westmoreland Church in Bethesda, Maryland. And she will speak about decisions about our bodies and our lives and her own decision to have an abortion, the grounding from which she did that, and also how it has led to her advocacy for reproductive justice. Kaeley.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you, Essence. That was so comprehensive and right on. It's really great to be here with you all today. As Barbara said, my name is Reverend Kaeley McEvoy, and I am coming to you all today from Washington, D.C., and serve at a congregation in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm here also to be excited with First Church, which is one of my adult faith homes. So it is so good to be here with folks that I look up to, like Barbara and Sandy, and also folks that inspire me, like Essence. I wanted to start our time together by offering just a moment to check in with our bodies. We just took in a lot of information from Barbara and Essence that is really powerful stuff. And this work of reproductive dignity is work that is so aligned with our embodied and incarnational understanding of theology and the way that we live our lives. It feels important to acknowledge that this stuff really sits in our flesh and our bones. So let's take a breath or two together right now. So as you breathe and feel that spirit of God in your lungs, think about if you're holding any tightness in your body. Maybe even subconsciously, some of this hard, sad, grieving information lives within us. So it's important to acknowledge that. And let's breathe in again. And also acknowledge that we are held in the loving hands of a big God, full of love and strength. You, beloved friends, are a magnificent creation of the divine, and we do all of this work with that fact grounding us. To begin my portion of the discussion today, I am going to share my personal story of reproductive decision-making with you all. And I'm going to start that by reading a poem. Poetry is one of the ways that I connect with the spirit. And there are so many different ways to storytell our reproductive stories because everyone has one. Because we were born, we have a reproductive story. So please open your ears and receive this poem with grace. The title of the poem is called Last Night I Was Lonely, and it was written in the spring of 2017 when I was completing my second year of seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Last night I was lonely. Last night I sat on my pastor's couch and rested my head on a pillow that looked like a flower. I told her I was sad, and she told me she was sad too. Then she asked when I knew I was with child. I said September. She raised her hands and she counted to 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We both sighed. I said I do not want to cry fully in this space, so I left the church potluck a bit early. Last night I was lonely, so I went into the kitchen and I heated up warm water and I put mint leaves in a mug. I sat on my couch with a blanket and a friend, and we talked about the things that hurt us and the things that make us laugh, and eventually we both cried. I said to her, I am done with shrinking, and we thought that that was a good conclusion. We went to our separate bedrooms. Last night I was lonely, so I lit a candle. I asked Oshun if she felt like joining me, and we showered in New York City tap water. The water was hot. I poured olive oil on my hair. I rubbed Epsom salt with lavender on my stomach, hoping it would reach my womb. I put on my bathrobe. Last night I was lonely, so I put books in my bed, a heavy one, a memoir, a book of poetry, the collected lyrics of Patti Smith. Last night I was lonely, so I tried to pick up a book, and yet I could not read. Last night I was lonely, so I tried to close my eyes and pray, yet I can and could not pray. Last night I was lonely, so I tried to breathe with intention, and I could a bit. Last night I was lonely, so I decided I would cry for my departed child, 9 months old in 3 days. Last night I was so very lonely, so I slept. Thank you for your grace and kindness in receiving that reflection. When I found out I was pregnant in the second year of theological education, it was in the fall of 2016. During the start of the semester, I was having a lot of trouble focusing in class, feeling extremely lethargic, hitting roadblocks in my internship site, which was all really new to me. I was wondering if I was supposed to be in seminary because this was all getting so hard so fast. This was also the season of the election of Donald Trump. And I just wondered if maybe the whole world was supposed to be a little sadder at this time. And my partner at that time was also in seminary with me, studying to be an ordained Methodist minister, and he supported my potential depression that we thought encouraged me to seek therapy and helped me to ask for extensions on my homework, something I had never done before. And then he asked me one day, when was the last time I had gotten my period? And I kind of shrugged it off because I was so stressed, and I was just stressed. I pushed through my things, and it was about maybe a month later when he asked again, can we loop back around on that period thing? I took a test, a pregnancy test, mostly to appease him. I kind of rolled my eyes and agreed. And a little bit like that election of Donald Trump, I just didn't believe that it was real. I took 3 positive at-home tests before I really thought that this possibility was a reality. So in sort of shock and disbelief, the next day I went to the Student Medical Center at Columbia University, which is right next to Union Seminary, and I took a blood test. The test was positive, and I started to live into this reality that I was with child. There is a cathedral right next to Columbia University, St. John the Divine. It's a beautiful Episcopalian cathedral. It's kind of a touristy church, a little bit like our National Cathedral here in Washington. It has beautiful alcoves of art and stained glass, and although Episcopalian is not my direct faith lineage, I always found peace strolling through the cathedral. So I asked my partner if we could go there after the positive test on our walk home. While we were walking around the cathedral, there was a small chapel in the back left corner that had an art exhibit with a gold and bronze sculpture of Jesus, a Jesus in the feminine form. It was called the Christa statue. I would also encourage you to Google this beautiful image. It is a Jesus on a cross with breasts and long hair. So I sat below the Christa statue and I cried. And I cried and I cried. And my partner asked me if I wanted to pray, and I said yes. So we prayed together for strength, grace, and love. Those were the words that we prayed together. A few days later, I would be holding the hands of a nurse at the Planned Parenthood clinic on Bleecker Street in the lower part of Manhattan, with my back reclined, looking up at the ceiling, reciting that prayer over and over again while receiving an abortion. Strength, grace, love. Strength, grace, love. Like I said a little bit earlier, the cathedral where Christa was and where I prayed is a little bit of a tourist attraction. There are sometimes double-decker buses outside the cathedral to take photos of the architecture. And that fact's important because when I was sitting in that cathedral, in that little corner, that was where I took out my cell phone and I began calling doctors' offices to schedule an abortion. And although at the time I did have private insurance, I called a handful of offices before realizing that Planned Parenthood was still the best option. And while I was making those phone calls in the cathedral, a group of tourists that were being led by a tour guide were walking around. They were wanting to see the small chapel where I was sitting, where the Christa statue was, because it was there as a rotating art exhibit. But my partner, a Southern gentleman and Methodist pastor, as I said, stood outside and stood guard while I made those phone calls. The tour guide came up to him and asked if the group could enter the chapel? And he said, no. He looked that tour guide in the eye and he said, no, you cannot enter because something holy is happening here. Something holy is happening here, friends. Our decisions about reproduction are holy and sacred. And as Christians, as people who believe that birth is central to our entire narrative of Christ, we come from a tradition that hinges on the bodies of people who can get pregnant, just like Mary. As I said earlier, we all have a reproductive story because we are all alive. And we as Christians all have a duty to believe that honoring reproductive decision-making and reproductive dignity is a part of our faith because our God chose to come in the earth in a form of a baby and in the womb of a teenager. And there are a multitude of ways, as Essence described to us, that we can support these reproductive decisions, that we can create that holy ground. Sandy is going to explain some legislative efforts, one way of doing that in a bit. And we will talk about how all of those reproductive realities, whether that be someone deciding they want to take on IVF, or someone who wants to adopt, or a trans man who's looking to become pregnant, where churches can be places where those discussions of prayer and healing and discernment and spiritual care take place. When I was discerning and recovering from my abortion, I benefited from Barbara's work in the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion and the 4 mothers of the repro movement before me, because I was actually working at Judson Memorial Church, one of the centers for the reproduction movement and a safe place during that clergy consultation on abortion time period. My pastor at the time, who offered me her couch and a pillow to lie on, Reverend Donna Scopper, was also part of the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. So when I left a church potluck early to cry, it didn't shock anyone. I'd like to, before I close, just offer 2 other opportunities to plug into this work and to build on this holy ground that has been created before us and that will be created by us. First, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice has recently launched an online learning platform called the Religion and Repro Learning Center. I was one of the contributing authors to their curriculum about compassionate care in reproductive decision-making, which is some of that counseling work that Barbara was talking about earlier, and really a new skill that churches, progressive churches, are going to need to do in the coming months and weeks and years. The religious right has seeped themselves in theology, and we also, as progressive Christians, must be able to become versed in our own theology. The Religion Repro Center is a place to do that. There are multiple classes, so I will forward the link in the chat for that learning center, but it is all online and it is all free right now, so plug in. And the second invitation is also from the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice. Reverend Katie Zay, their CEO, has released a new book recently called A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement. Reverend Zay is going to be hosting a virtual book launch in the middle of February that I will be taking part in. But that is a good study book for your congregations. It is a mix of personal stories and also information. So go ahead and give that book in order as well. A Complicated Choice, which really holds the many nuances to this conversation that are not just pro-life and pro-choice. That binary is gone. It has not been helpful to us. As Essence said, this is about access, and this is about expanding care and services. So thank you for listening, friends, for being present with me and your bodies and the Holy Spirit. Sandy, I look forward to hearing about next steps from you.
Wow. I am truly full of gratitude to enter this sacred space that you all have created. Thank you, Barbara, Essence, Kaeley. My goodness, it's a bit daunting to step into this space to try to talk about legislative strategy, but here we go. But I want to ground my overview in a personal story as well. When I was in seminary, my second year, I decided to do a field placement at a women's health clinic, and so I was working at the New Haven Women's Health Clinic, and I really my first experience of going to the clinic really made an impression on me. There were two very heavy reinforced doors, and you had to buzz through the first one where you were kind of in a little corridor waiting area, and then approved to be buzzed into the actual waiting room. And when I began my orientation, of course, I was thinking they're going to be telling me about the services that they provide, about the demographics of the women who come, what to be sensitive about, how to do intake forms, what counseling protocols are. All of those things I thought would be the top of my orientation. And the very first thing that they told me was, if there's a bomb threat, you want to go into this stairwell. And they also told me that on Saturdays, when abortion services were offered at the clinic, that there were often protesters. And they said, just don't be surprised when you come to the clinic and there are New Haven police mounted on horses blocking the protesters from the clinic. And what that showed me so crystal clearly, in a way I couldn't have seen before, is that in a white supremacist patriarchal society, women's reproductive health care, women's well-being, women's autonomy is dangerous. It has always been dangerous, and it is today. And I think if you have had an experience of visiting a women's health clinic, the degree to which many of them have had to fortify themselves in the face of opponents of abortion is chilling. And so I want to lay that context out, that this is, as Essence was saying, what we're talking about is we're simply talking about the well-being of women and their families, but that's a dangerous thing. It always has been, and it is right now, and it's important for us to know that. The other piece I want to lay out in terms of the context is that we are still living in the middle of a global pandemic that has once again laid bare the incredible disparities in economic and social and health services in this country. So we know that the most vulnerable in our society are suffering even more in a pandemic. And we're also in a context of heightened violence against women, given the COVID pandemic is one of the factors. And we still have yet to authorize the Violence Against Women Act in the Senate. So this is some of the context that we're working in. And I want to emphasize that the disparities in access to healthcare services really intersects here, because the clinic that I worked at in New Haven and many of the clinics offer a whole array of healthcare services for women, mental health care, prenatal care, postnatal care, domestic violence counseling, cancer screenings, other kinds of healthcare screenings. So this is a wide variety of care that stands threatened to be restricted if the Supreme Court should decide to erode or overturn Roe v. Wade. So that is a tricky political climate that we're facing, a challenging one. But I think that if we focus on that narrative of shifting that narrative to say that we know this from empirical fact from around the world, that when women and girls have access to education, autonomy over their bodies, are free from violence, communities thrive. Not just women, communities thrive. And so I really appreciated what Essen said about, kind of moving from the rights argument to the justice argument, because it's more than about a woman's right. It is about the rights of our communities and our families to thrive. And I think that is so important, in that's one way that we can influence the debate, is by continuing to lift that message up in what will be a difficult couple of months ahead. So given the change in the makeup of the Supreme Court over the last several years, the states, in anticipation of the possibility of challenging Roe, have been very opponents of abortion access and reproductive health care access have been very active on a state level, anticipating a decision around Roe. So in 2021, last year, 23 states passed a restrictive abortion measures. There were over 400 in total. And in many of those states, the laws are what they call trigger laws. So they are ready to be enacted as soon as the decision is made. And what that will mean, just right off the bat, is that for 135 million women in this country, their access to healthcare through a women's clinic will be restricted. So we have one federal backstop to this scenario, the Women's Health Protection Act. And I will, if you go to the UCC website and click on our justice work, you can find that action alert. So the Women's Health Protection Act basically would step in to prevent states from interfering with a women's right to reproductive access. It's passed the House, but it is stalled in the Senate, where many good bills go to die, unfortunately, these days. And so we wanted to continue to push on that. But what it also made us realize, those of us who do justice advocacy on a federal level, and our UCC Washington office is a small but mighty office, but we don't have the capacity to do the kind of state work that we're facing right now. And it's not just around reproductive justice, it's around voting rights and many other rights. So that's why we're so excited to have partnered with Chisholm and to have Essence Ellis be working with us. And so we have been hard at work developing a plan to dive deep into 4 states where we know that we have a good, strong UCC presence and activists, and also where we know we have lots of reproductive justice allies, because we're going to really need to be in a large coalition moving forward. And so those states are Missouri, Texas, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. And so this is an experiment for us, really. We haven't had the capacity to try to do this. So we are grateful that Essence has taken up this task of finding out what's happening in those states. Is there any movement to overturn restrictive laws? Are there positive laws that are being proposed? What's kind of happening? What's the temperature in those states? Who's working on this, and how can we partner and amplify those voices? And so we are just really, really excited to be doing this work with Essence. I would leave us with these thoughts in terms of how we can move forward. Certainly conversations with friends and family are influential. They're more influential than we may realize. And even if you happen to be like me in the District of Columbia, which has no congressional representation, there are ways to reach out to others and try to encourage this conversation to happen in other places. That, as I mentioned before, changing the narrative around reproductive healthcare access and justice, moving away from that. It's the binary that Kaeley talked about so well. It's so much more than that binary, and moving away from that to talk about, this is about giving women and girls that autonomy over their own bodies, access to education, freedom from violence, and economic opportunity, so that our families can all thrive, our communities can all thrive. And so that's a really important message, and we can do that by writing op-eds, letters to the editor. If you're a social media person, use your social media, go on talk shows. I know that can be challenging sometimes. But all of those things are things that I think that we need to do. And lastly, I'll just say, if you are not already a member of the UCC Justice and Peace Action Network, please do sign up by going to the ucc.org website, and you will receive weekly alerts. And we just actually sent out recently an alert on the Women's Health Protection Act. So that is a good way to stay in touch, not only about this issue, but about other issues. And I just would add to that, I don't think that it's coincidental that we're facing threats to voting rights, reproductive justice, and threats to access and empowerment on a whole lot of levels. So this is a fight that we all need to be in. Men, women, we all, families. This is about all of us, and so we all need to be there and be involved and be a presence.
Thank you very much, Sandy. You have given us some marching orders, some work to do, and thank you very much for your work day in and day out on the justice issues of the United Church of Christ. I am now going to turn it over to the Reverend Amanda Hendler-Voss, who is a senior minister at First Congregational Church. And Amanda will lead us in a time of questions and answers and sharing our reflections and our own, the kind of reproductive stories that we carry, each one of us.
Rose, we can't hear you. Oh, I wonder if you can share your question in the chat. In the meantime, let's go to Nan quickly.
This is very interesting as someone who's come from the more traditional definition of reproductive health to hear Essence's description of reproductive justice was very, very interesting and I think exciting in terms of where that takes us. I was wondering, Sandy and Essence, and you're working on the state level together to do some legislative and coalition building, whether you're going to have a broad agenda, how broad the agenda is going to be, whether you're going to try to target the agenda, or how you're going to begin a focus on the state level when the issues are sort of specifically hitting at the moment, but for the long term are so big and difficult.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll take a stab at it. And Essence, feel free to jump in. But our work at this point is going to be targeted in the sense that what we're going to do is find out where these states are in terms of abortion restriction legislation that they either have already passed or they're considering. So we have in many states what we're calling trigger laws. So should Roe v. Wade be overturned or undermined, they would go into effect immediately. So that some of these have already been passed, they're just waiting. So one of the things that we really want to try to do is dive into these states and find out, what's happening, where's the push on the part of our allies to either overturn state-based restrictive laws in those states, or to work for abortion expansion laws. So that's really kind of where we're focusing in this moment. And because state legislatures are so different in the way they meet and hold their sessions and all of those things, and different states are in different places in terms of whether or not they have trigger laws or are poised to introduce other bans. So we're kind of focusing right there for now, hoping that we learn a lot.
Thank you so much.
Also, can I throw something in really quick?
Yeah, please.
I think it's also important to note, and Cindy has told me this before, but just realizing that people are already on the ground, they're already coalition building, people already have plans intact. A lot of organizations really just need someone to amplify their voice, someone who has resources, who has a check to write, to come in and support them. And so we're really not trying to come in and like co-opt a movement. We're trying to uplift movements and organizing and legislating that's already in motion.
Thank you, Essence. Rose, do you want to try to unmute, or do you want me to read out what you've put in the chat? Read it out. Yeah, it's not working. It's not working. I'm going to mute you. It sounds a little, your voice is distorted somehow. It says, Rose wrote, I would appreciate someone starting a website, something similar to moveon.org that would let us know who to call, who to write, where to march to ensure that Roe v. Wade is protected. She continues, this issue is so upsetting. Sometimes I put it on the back burner because of other stressors in my life. But if someone could be keeping watch and making action recommendations, that would be so valuable. And so Barbara writes that Kaeley may wish to speak to reproductive rights expansion law being developed in Maryland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would actually speak to Rose's question as well. There was a conference this past week that was happening virtually called the Sacred Network, which, as Essence said, people are working on this, people are doing this, and kind of the ecosystem of repro work in the faith world is also really weird right now, because the term has been used that it's sort of a dead area for funding, because the orgs that want to do repro work, their funders usually want to fund the secular organizations like Planned Parenthood. And then the funders of some of the religious work don't want to put funding to repro because that's hard. So there's sort of this weird gap. And Sacred is a coalition that is kind of stepping into that gap, founded by people that have been doing this work in Texas mostly, and have grabbed partners from the rest of the country. So in terms of like a website, Rose, I would say like Sacred right now is kind of stepping into that, like Clergy Consultation Service. Yeah, so UCC Justice and Witness co-sponsored this this thing, and there are other denominations that are also sponsoring it. So I would say it's both a an institutional and an ad hoc coalition. I don't know if you want to add anything, Sandy or Essence.
I do. Actually, yeah, thank you, Kaeley. Actually, this is a great opportunity for me to do a commercial too. If you haven't already, and I pray that everybody here already has, if you have not joined the United Church of Christ Justice and Peace Action Network, please do. You just go to ucc.org and you'll find there's several drop downs and you'll find Washington office. It's very easy. You just give us your name and your email address. If you are a member of the network, you will receive weekly action alerts on things that you can take action on, as well as a monthly electronic newsletter that will contain things like an announcement about the Sacred Gathering or other things that are happening. So I really encourage you to kind of keep posted. This is one of our big priority issues that we're working on. So we're certainly going to keep people informed. And then I know lots of our colleagues, like as somebody referenced the National Council of Jewish Women, I think that was you, Essence, and so many other. We do have a few faith-based partners that we are partnering with. So stay tuned to those networks as we move forward.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sandy. And then just in terms of state legislation, we are also in a fun spot of having Virginia legislation to work on, DC legislation to work on, and Maryland legislation to work on. And I am connected most to the Maryland work, as Westmoreland is located in Bethesda, and offer kind of a call to action from the Maryland Planned Parenthood, which Barbara has connected me with recently. There is a state-based legislation that will be coming out this session, the Maryland Abortion Care Access Act. So they are currently in the stage of collecting testimony for that, written testimony. So if you have a Maryland address, let me know, and we can connect in that way. But I do want to underscore kind of this shift in advocacy work that will be really state-based in the coming time, which is why we got to make DC a state, you know?
Oh, we know.
Amen, amen.
So I do want to bring us fairly quickly to a close. I did note that Rose had another comment in the chat, which is about where are the places, you know, that we're speaking to the grief that can take place when people do choose to have an abortion. And I didn't know if anybody wanted to speak to that.
I would love to speak about that. Because that book I mentioned earlier, Katie Zay's A Complicated Choice, has a lot of stories of grief that we do not lift up as much. And one part of the kind of compassionate care curriculum that RCRC and perhaps Sacred are going to dive into, actually has a whole section about ritual building around reproductive loss. There are a lot of beautiful handmade liturgies talking about, from baby naming to tree planting to honor reproductive loss. So we are also lucky in the United Church of Christ that we have the theological flexibility to create some of those old rituals. So I really think that question of learning how to grieve together, which is something the pandemic is also challenging us to do better as a congregational body of God, and also something I'll speak for myself as a white-bodied person that white supremacist culture does not encourage us doing, talking about these hard, mournful things.
Thank you, Kaeley. And, the grief piece also connects to ways in which women who are in the midst of a miscarriage and need a D&C procedure, which in some states is being restricted by some of these restrictive laws. Parents who find out in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy that their child is going to have multiple challenges and may indeed die shortly after birth, and they're trying to choose the way with the least amount of suffering for their child. These kinds of stories are inclusive of grief and get lumped into this category of abortion care, and we need to have this holistic framework to hold it all, truly. I saw there was one more thing in here. Oh, okay. So Kaeley has shared in the chat the information about the Sacred Network. Friends, I want to draw us to a close, perhaps with prayer. And so I want to thank again our panelists. I think we could continue to have this conversation, and I think we will. We know what is likely coming in June. We know this is a conversation that we need to continue to have, not only here, but in our families, in our communities, and more widely within the United Church of Christ and even ecumenically. So let us continue to be about this conversation. And again, please feel free to be in touch with me if there are specific ways in which you would like to see us continue this conversation at First Church. With that, I invite us to settle our bodies and reconnect with our breath and have a moment of prayer together. Loving God, we thank you for this time, which truly has been sacred ground for us, as we acknowledge each one created in your image and the sacred worth of each human being, especially women who find themselves making choices about their bodies in circumstances that don't fully embrace their ability to do so. God, we lift up to you today the precarious situation in our nation. We lift up clinics that provide a variety of care for women and for non-binary persons, for those seeking reproductive justice. We lift up to you those who are on the front lines, who experience the kind of terror of being threatened regularly. And we ask for their safety. We ask that they might continue to have strength, as especially in some states, they will be shut down, and in other states, their traffic will increase exponentially. We pray for them. We lift up also those who are most impacted by the decisions that are likely to be made. We know that these are women of color, Black women, immigrant women, Latinx women. And we pray that those who do not have the financial resources, those who find themselves in situations of domestic violence, girls, young teens, we pray for them and pray that you would open up ways for them to connect to supportive adults and sisters and friends within their communities, that you would create faith communities as safe houses, that you would help there to spring up nonprofit organizations and organizers within communities that would create safe space and sacred ground for these women to be able to make difficult choices about their own bodies and their lives. And we pray especially, God, for those who are making policy decisions, for those who are making decisions in our courts, for state legislatures. We pray for all of those who are in positions of influence and power. Help us to remember our own influence and power. Help us to raise our collective voices, to call for justice, to call for reproductive justice. We do all of these things in your name of love, for which we are so grateful. Amen. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thanks again to our extraordinary panelists today.